Um, I first just want to note that the stories I share about my adoption are my personal stories and only really encompass my personal experiences. I touch a bit about my sister's adoption as well, but that's just my experience being a part of her adoption process as well. So I acknowledge that I'm in Vancouver, which is on the West Coast, and that is on the land of the unceded territories, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm thankful to be on this here to share my stories with you. So I've lived in Canada for most of my life, 22 out of 23 of my years. And although it feels like I've lived in Canada since I was born, I was originally born somewhere near Shaoyang in the Hunan province of China and spent my first year of life living in an orphanage. The image on the right is an aerial view of where the orphanage is located in Shaoyang, and the exact location of where I was born can't be traced, or they don't know exactly where I'm from. And so the places that I have grown up, however, are in Maidstone, Ontario, the town where when people ask is what I say where I'm from, and Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, where I've lived since I was 6 years old. And so throughout my life, when people ask where are you from, I always answer and continue to answer Maidstone, Ontario. But then this kind of simple question becomes something more complex when people follow up and ask, but where are you really from? And I usually don't have an answer or clear answer for them. And so kind of my start of kind of trying to understand or come to terms with my own identity is 3 years ago. My mom, my sister, and I went on a trip to China to visit the areas where my sister and I were born and the orphanages we lived at. And this is a trip that many adopted children go on to see what country or where they are from. And so one thing that stood out to me during this trip was the sign that they had up at my sister's orphanage when we arrived, and it says, "Welcome home, Guang Zhimei," and Zhimei was her given name at the orphanage. But this idea of being welcomed home was very odd to me, as I've never called or identified China as being my home. So the trip really made me kind of question what the idea of home is and what it means to be part of the Chinese diaspora as an adopted person. And so for me, especially after that trip, it was kind of important to identify myself or try to find an identity at that point that was a starting point for me to situate myself as a Chinese person in Canada who has lived in Canada most of my life, or all of my life that I can remember. So in short, I kind of came up with this just simple phrase of saying I'm a Chinese Canadian transracial adoptee woman. And there are many flaws to this self-identification and many aspects of my person that I am missing from this description of myself. It doesn't really encompass all of who I am. So I'll do kind of a short unpacking of this description and how it's developed in the many environments and experiences that I've had throughout my life. So to start off, I'll kind of describe the aspects of me that I would say fall into this kind of Chinese woman. So by grouping these together, I've grouped them because these two factors are kind of the reason why I'm here now where I am. It is important for me in this identification to acknowledge my gender, because being born during the one-child policy in China, and because of this law, a lot of female born babies were abandoned and given up by their birth families, and it was more desirable to have a son. So from a young age, I always saw that being a girl or being a woman was a lesser gender, just based off that principle of why I was put up for adoption, and something that I came to terms with growing up. And then as a person of Chinese ethnicity growing up in rural Ontario, I really stuck out as a sore thumb. I was the only person of color in my town that I could remember. It was really evident from a young age that I'd be considered as the other in most settings, even in my family. Until my sister came, I was the only person who wasn't from British heritage. And so I never really, and then moving to Kitchener, I never really felt accepted in the Chinese communities I tried to engage with, nor did I feel fully accepted as a person of Chinese ethnicity in the other communities I surrounded myself with, including my family. And this idea of the kind of Canadian transracial adoptee, so being taken from China and then living in Canada for my entire life, and then my mother being from British descent and me being from Chinese descent, and then being an adoptee is kind of the second part of my identity. So I always knew that I was an adoptee, and my mother never hid that from me. My basic understanding of it as a child was that I didn't have a family, and my mom wanted to start a family, so she came to China and got me. But it's a lot more complex than that, not just in my own personal story itself, but in kind of international adoption as well. And so my mom, like I mentioned before, her parents immigrated from the UK to Canada. And until my sister was adopted, I was the only person from a different ethnicity in my family. And so growing up, I really tried to kind of pretend that I wasn't Chinese, or I didn't really acknowledge that I was Chinese, even though I looked different and I came from somewhere else than my family. It's really evident, for example, in elementary school when we'd have to do these school assignments on our heritage and our family history, and my teachers wouldn't allow me to do projects on England, but would make me do them on China. This would kind of infuriate me as a child, because from my understanding, my family was from England, and with the resources I had access to as a child, I knew nothing of China, and I didn't really connect with that as a place where I was from. And so within that as well, I've always asked, and going on that trip kind of became a bit more clear as to why my mom would travel around the world and why she wanted a Chinese baby. And with that thought, thinking about international adoption kind of as a colonial process of being this idea of going to a foreign country and saving a child and then raising them to have this quote unquote better life in Canada. And growing up with the privileges of a white family is something I've had to come to terms with and question. But I am quite grateful for being adopted, and I've appreciated the life I've lived. But I do have problems with the idea of removing a child from where they're from their land, and where their families are, and resettling them somewhere across the world, especially in a country founded on stolen lands. So in kind of conclusion, and where I am currently, I've been thinking, well, I think that being an adoptee has given me the self-awareness and opportunity to look at my environment with the perspectives of being an outsider in almost every situation. I kind of experience the spaces I'm in, and seeing them from the perspective of the other, or always feeling like the other myself. So thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks. Okay, I will share my screen. Okay, so I'm located currently in Cambridge, situated along the Haldeman Tract, which is land that was granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and I'm within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. So that's where I am. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lily, and I want to talk about being a Vietnamese female, because growing up in Canada, and I was born in Canada, I grew up not really wanting to learn about my Vietnamese culture. And this came from the female expectations of my family and society. I figured if I didn't care about my culture, I could escape the skewed pressures of the patriarchy, at least in an intimate setting. I would forsake my family to escape these expectations, because dealing with it in anonymity is a lot easier, i.e. from a vague cloud of societal expectations, rather than from my family directly telling me my places as a female, what I could or could not do, and sometimes showing me through how the women in my family were treated, or how they acted, and what they couldn't do. So what that meant was my family's opinions of me were treated as the same opinions coming from a big cloud of societal expectations. They were not heavier and they didn't mean more to me. And so it became really easy to dismiss my family and their cultural values because I grew up in, similar to Laura, an overwhelmingly white neighborhood. In grade school, I was in a class of 30 and I was the only person of color. And in high school, I was in a class of 300 and there were only 3 Asian girls in my class. The rest were white, not even POC. And my family relationship was also quite heavily damaged for a multitude of reasons. So I didn't spend time with my family. I didn't live with them. And as I grew up, it became convenient to distance myself from my Vietnamese identity. And this is pretty similar to Laura when she mentioned that there was an emphasis for her to consider China as her home when she was younger with school assignments. It was a bit different for me with regards to timeline assignments of like family trees, when I was born, things like that. I remember everyone would come in with their family trees, elaborate family trees, whereas most people in my family tree were dead or missing. So it wasn't really the same type of treatment that I got. And also I wasn't given any slack for it. My teachers didn't understand that. And they would often fail me on assignments like that because I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to communicate it. And I was really young. So it became a really compounded issue. So because of my resistance to patriarchal values and other reasons, it was incredibly easy for me growing up to not address the culture in which I came from, to avoid the smothering patriarchal values that confronted me growing up. With what little control I had, I felt like I had to escape the culture that bred me. And this led to a twofold struggle that I'm still dealing with. One is that I'm very separate from my Vietnamese identity. And 2 is that every day I'm confronted with the struggles of being female. However, recently I've had to confront a lot of what I thought I could ignore, my family and my Vietnamese identity. Because 1 month ago, I spoke to my father for the first time in 8 years. He talked to me about his experience with the war. We created drawings together, and it was the first time anyone from my family had sat down with me and talked to me about it. For context, all my 9 aunts and uncles on my dad's side experienced the war either by serving in it or escaping it or dying from it. And when I first took on this project, I thought I'd be able to put aside my own personal feelings towards my father. I thought that this conversation, despite it being the first conversation of 8 years, I thought that didn't matter, that this was purely a business conversation. And I'm still surprised at how wrong I was. Because hearing my father tell me about what he saw, hearing what he remembers in great detail in some areas, and the complete blankness or refusal to remember in some other scenes, it's difficult not to empathize because the story is of my family. This is my father, and this is a big part of who he is, and that's who I am as well. A small thing that acted as a piece of revelation for me was the fish tank. My father remembered in great detail fish in every story, and the first fish to appear in his memory, the conversation went as such. Oh, I remember now. The table is here and there's a fish tank because my father loved fish tanks. Maybe you remember that we had a fish tank when you're growing up. I also love fish tanks. And I've grown up always loving fish. And suddenly I felt so tied into the story, not just as a documenter, but as a character in it. My father was an absent father, an alcoholic, and many other things, and I understand why. Hearing his story, I can understand the trauma. It's heartbreaking, and it's heartbreaking to consider his own experiences, but it's heartbreaking to have to come to terms with, understand why my father wasn't in my life. The story that he told me is one that we're both living through. Because of this conversation, I learned a lot about myself and why I am the way I am, just like the way my father is the way he is. So currently, I'm still trying to understand how the story of my family, how to navigate it, how I digest it, and how I carry it with me. Because for so long, I hated being around my family. I hated that they would say things to my face I thought were reserved to anonymous internet comments about me, my body, the space I took up. But after this conversation with my father, I want to find a way to connect more with my Vietnamese identity because it has so much weight that I just left behind. And I want to learn how to embrace a culture that I never felt embraced me because of my identity.
Thanks, Lily.
Thanks, Lily. That was amazing. And same with Laura. I hope you got the last. Okay, Give me 1 second. Can you guys see the white screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so like Lily, I'm located in UWSA region, which is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. On a broader scale, that's the Haldeman Tract, which includes 6 miles on both sides of the Grand River, and that is land promised to the Six Nations. Okay, I'm gonna get started. So I'm Cynthia, if you guys don't know who I am. It's really nice to meet you. The story of my upbringing has a lot of parallels to Lily and Laura's. So I was born in Waterloo, Ontario, and I've lived here my entire life. My mom and dad are from Beijing and Wuhan, China, respectively. And that was the only thing I knew how to say about my heritage as a child. In school, I said it with a really lackluster tone and a lost gaze. After, I usually said, but I was born here, as a way to redeem myself. I thought saying that would gain me acceptance. To me, the Asian Canadian immigrant story felt like a monolith. I thought my background made me weird rather than unique. And so I'd rather just be a one-dimensional person. I thought no one really wanted to hear another archetypal story of sacrifice and loss, so I kept my mouth shut and I only ever shared parts of me that were traditionally Canadian. Not only did I suppress sharing my heritage, I also suppressed learning about it. I brought up a cloud of apathy to every Asian event. That's literally what I called them: Asian dinner parties, Chinese school, the visits to Markham to see the only relatives I have here in Canada, and that trip that all immigrants are familiar with, which we call going back. These functions didn't feel fulfilling or enriching. They felt more so like an obligation, like something that was fleeting or customary. Why? I think it's because I resisted having an identity. My parents never told me about their parents or their childhood at the dinner table. Because of it, they did that because they needed to have more time to learn about English in Canada. And I always admired them a lot for it, but I felt like I had lost something. It was kind of like, this is our new life. Why should we revisit the past? I don't want to make sweeping statements, but it feels like it's common in immigrant families to fixate on the future. It's that idea of leaving things behind and sacrificing something to gain something better, to have a so-called better life, which Laura said herself. So in similar fashion, my parents chose to assimilate into Western culture and sacrifice of our native Chinese culture in the household. So the one major example of this is my lack of language. I don't speak Mandarin. I can't communicate with my grandma when she comes to visit. I can't even ask her about her day, let alone her entire past. I could only say not hungry when she offered me meals and give an automated of acknowledgement when she lectured me about wearing socks in the house and not drinking ice water. When I went back to China at the age of 7, I felt similarly paralyzed. I lived at my grandma's apartment where I watched TV that I couldn't understand, and I played card games with my uncle to substitute for conversation. I wandered through Beijing unconsciously with the knowledge that I would go home soon, as if Beijing could never be a home. Everyone there looked like me, but again, it felt temporary, customary, like a detachable limb that I could take off, the Chinese in Chinese Canadian. Despite meeting a flurry of relatives who stared at me, trying to find signs of me being whitewashed, I was convinced my lineage began with my parents, with the rush into English as they first stepped off the plane. I could not really comprehend any history before that, any branches of our family tree. The weird thing is, I was fine with it, fine with erasing, cleansing, masking, repressing, reducing, all the words I hate when used by colonizers. I was fine with it until I started architecture school. These are some screenshots from 1A1B that I wanted to share. You guys might recognize it's Miro. Some jokes. So architecture at UW forced me to confront who I am. And no, this is not a promo for UW architecture because this revelation could have occurred in any setting. At first, I was designing spaces for the typical white working class body. I did it obliviously because for so long I trapped myself in the Occidental world. I was still kneeling to whiteness. I resisted any other culture. And when I realized that, I knew I had to change. It was actually the cultural history program that made me confront all of these ideas. Rick and RJ, who many of you probably know, really made me think about who I am and what I stand for and how that manifests itself in my work. Going into second year in the fall, it's really my goal to be authentic, to have a cause, and to also advocate. I realize that what I'm telling you guys today doesn't really have a resolution, but that's okay. I truly believe that grappling with one's identity is a lifelong process. I'm really just getting started. So I really appreciate you guys coming today and tuning into my journey, as well as sharing the space with Lily and Laura, two incredible women. Thanks, Yiming, for inviting me to speak. I was really hesitant on saying yes because I didn't know if my story had any gravity, but Yiming, you really helped me realize that everyone has something to say, whether you're full or you're empty. That's a dark note, so let's just go back to the clown picture. Thanks, guys.